there's something very powerful about saying, I want to save your life, I don't want to fix you. Like, and just giving somebody a clean needle or something else that will just help them in what they want to do often opens the door for larger transformation, because people start to feel more valued and feel more worthwhile and feel like, well, somebody thinks I deserve to live. Like, maybe I should investigate this more. And you also see a lot of times people who do needle exchange or work in needle exchange programs are in recovery themselves. So the people who show up for services are like, well, how did you quit? And that opens the door. So there's many different ways that it can be a very, very powerful way to help people. And even if they never get into recovery, a lot of times people who become engaged in needle exchange will dramatically reduce the harm around their addictions, because they feel more valued and because they have the tools that they need to protect themselves.
Well, this is our syringe exchange. In here, most people will come right through our doors and come straight in here to access syringe exchange services, and they'll show us their syringe exchange card with their code on it. This is a blank one. And if they have dirty syringes, they'll end up in here. And if they're used syringes, they have lots of them in a box or in a sharps container, they'll end up right in here in this basket. And so mostly people will come in and ask for whatever type of syringes they need. And the person who's working in here, either a volunteer or intern, sometimes I'm in here, and they will get, these are the most common syringes, the half cc's. So we usually give these out 10 at a time. Some other syringes that people enjoy are the blue tips in here. The tips used to be blue, now they're orange, but people like to pop the cap off of them and so they can fill it with other stuff. And then some of the other syringes we have are the 3 cc's, and these are mostly for people who are utilizing intramuscular shots. So if you're shooting steroids, or you're shooting methadone, or any kind of sort of like hormones, at least for our trans clients, these are a big, I would say majority of the stuff that we give out in the syringe exchange is tea. Most of the people just come here just to get tea or whatever for the case. It's a really popular service, and also comes along with conversations about what's going on in people's lives, but also anything that has to do with, that's particularly related to our population. So the person in here will talk about Hep C transmission or Hep C prevention, HIV transmission, how to get a Narcan kit, so that way not only is a place you get syringes, but you also have an opportunity for engagement and also to get you into other services as well. And so this is kind of the entry point for a lot of people. I would say a lot of our participants kind of stay in this area, but when they do sort of make the transition from syringe exchange over to other services, this is often the space that happens before.
Long-term recovery involves, and you see this beautifully actually in some harm reduction settings, that people in some ways need to claim an identity that's other than that of an addict. If I become a needle exchange worker, I go out on the streets. Well, now what am I doing? Well, now I may be still an active user, but I'm also a peer counselor. I'm also an HIV activist. I'm also, I'm showing up someplace. I'm wearing a vest. I'm giving out stuff. I'm getting more complex.
Why do you think it's important to do outreach with syringe exchange?
It's better for the drug addicts that are scared to come into the exchange to get help, and it's for us to bring it out to them, because a lot of homeless people really don't like coming forward and letting people know their business. So this way it's much easier to help out the drug addicts that really don't want people in their business and do the syringe exchange with them.
Do you give out anything besides syringes?
Hygiene kits, razors, washcloths, socks if you have them, t-shirts, hats, stuff like that.
Do you find it rewarding to do outreach?
Oh yes, exactly. I love it. It's real rewarding. It's a real rewarding job to help somebody else out.
Why? Can you tell us some more?
I used to be a drug addict myself. I'm clean now 7.5 years, and when I was out here, it wasn't out here. So now that I'm clean, I'm able to give back to help.
One of my favorite parts of my job is when I see our peers and interns move on to bigger and better things. And we've actually had a really good track record with job placement within the field of HIV prevention, harm reduction, after they've completed their internship here. So much work goes into getting to that point when they're ready to leave. Not only the work experience that they gained, but being a part of this community and kind of holistically improving their lives.
The idea that if we break you down and just make you feel really awful about yourself, you will want to stop, completely misunderstands why people use. Confrontation attacks people who already feel horrible about themselves, and it shames people who already are terribly ashamed of themselves, and those feelings actually drive a lot of the addiction. So when you're increasing the feelings that drive the addiction, you are pushing people to use more. You are not pushing people to get into recovery. People who have drug problems need hope, and they need to feel connected to other people, and they need to feel that there are alternatives to drugs that will allow them to feel comfortable in their own skin. And if you don't provide those alternatives, it's very difficult to get people to get help.
There's a traditional view that active drug users can't benefit from psychotherapy. They need to be abstinent before they start therapy. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I think it's bogus. I think it's just so limiting for both the therapist and the client. There are ways to work with active users where they can be present for sessions and do the work and make progress.
Do you encourage active users to try not to be too intoxicated when they come into sessions?
Yeah, that is kind of one of the pitfalls. I mean, it depends because, you know, some people need to be intoxicated just to function. So it's a very kind of case-by-case basis. But if you're intoxicated to the point where you're nodding out and you're not able to engage, then the work probably becomes more around how can we help you allow you to be more engaged. Or in other words, do we need to set a different time for your sessions? Do we need to have our sessions on different days or at different points according to whether you go to your program or just whatever you need, whatever you as the client need to be able to be present.
Now, aren't you afraid as a pregnant woman to come here and work with people injecting heroin or smoking crack or things like that?
You know, well, this is my second pregnancy here, if that's any indication of how relatively safe I feel. It's an apprehension that I can understand. I think I felt that apprehension more when I was first starting as an employee, when I wasn't pregnant. I had not worked with substance use before coming here, and so just working with a new population was daunting in and of itself. But being pregnant, no, I gotta say, I do get asked that a lot, even by some of my doctors, and I feel quite the opposite, actually. I kind of feel like if anyone understands the value of new life, and it's our participants. I feel like our participants are, for the most part, people who would give anything to be able to start over, who would give anything to be able to go back knowing what they know now and make different choices for themselves. So I think when they see me and they see new life and that potential there, they honor that, and and I think they also value the innocence that comes with, you know, being a child, and the sense of, they have a very acute sense of justice, I feel, more so than other kinds of populations. They have been at, and they continue to be at the short end of the stick. They have the most stigma attached to them. They're the most oppressed of the oppressed. So to see me and this kind of like innocence of like a pregnant woman and what that embodies for them, they want to protect that. So I think, you know, for every chance that there might be someone out there that may be volatile and suddenly become aggressive or try to attack me even verbally downstairs, I would say there's about another 20 to 30 people down there that are gonna jump in and rescue me and protect me and not let anything ever happen to me, because that's just the amount of integrity that they have. And it's really a sad thing that just because they're drug users, people don't acknowledge that about them.
As a psychologist, I finished my clinical training and got my first job in a multimodality drug treatment program up in East Harlem back in the early 80s. And at that time, the disease model, abstinence-only approach to treatment was really the only game in town. And so I learned that approach and worked in a series of different jobs through the 80s, ultimately becoming the clinical director of a few programs, one a premier intensive outpatient program, working under the disease concept, abstinence-only approach. And through the course of those years, I discovered that looking at our outcome numbers in these various programs, that the majority of people that came to treatment didn't stay, or we had to discharge them because they didn't stop using. I began experimenting with, in my own private practice, treating substance users who were actively using, who were not willing, able, or ready to stop using. And in contrast to what the model predicted, many of these folks got meaningfully involved in treatment. Many of them reduced their use, many of them stopped. So my clinical experience, once again, in private practice, challenged this set of expectations related to the traditional approach.
Challenges, I tell you, they fall on the housing. I wish there were more subsidy programs to help the homeless, and that's one of the main issues. It's just the housing, lack of funding, especially for families, you know, that are in the reunification process, and also for single individuals. It seems very difficult for them to get placed.
In America, when we define addiction as a disease, we say, here's what we'll do. Let's build hospitals and treat people. In fact, the United States budget in social services has gone from encouraging employment and housing, on the one hand, towards encouraging specialized addiction treatment, which is exactly the wrong way to go. What if you take a guy from the inner city and put him in a hospital for a month, and he quits using heroin, and then you say, okay, bye, and he goes right back to the streets where he used to live? Everybody knows what's going to happen. If instead you're able to encourage that person to develop ability to work, to become part of a community, to perhaps settle down in a permanent relationship, to perhaps become a parent, those are the mechanisms which are most guaranteed. They're slow, they're difficult, they're expensive, they're comprehensive, which is why America hates them, because we don't think in terms of social solutions. We like to think, well, let's have a medical solution. So that's the single biggest danger confronting harm reduction is the misbegotten belief, oh, they're discovering great things in medicine. What we'll do is we'll use those medical solutions and we'll discourage people from being heroin addicts. Boom. In fact, that investment in medical solutions as opposed to social solutions in people's lives is a total misappropriation of resources and completely ineffective for addressing society-wide issues of addiction.
We would definitely like to add housing to our vision of our new headquarters. First of all, there certainly is not a lot of housing on the Lower East Side for those with HIV and AIDS and those who are in a harm reduction setting and therefore have not been required to be abstinent, but those who have expressed a desire to begin to make changes in their life. And so we are exploring what kind of housing, presumably fully supported housing, which could in fact be put in place and allow a person, as they become more self-sufficient and are able to increasingly engage in independent activities, to live in supported housing, but then ultimately to go on to the next phase of their lives and have the space then be available for others who need that immediate housing and that transition as they come to full self-sufficiency.
Starting with giving them a place to live. It's going to be a big help. But of course, Alan Marlett, who died, I believe in 2012, he did a big study with street alcoholics, and what they did was they tested the efficacy of a wet housing. Wet housing is where you allow an alcoholic to live someplace and to drink. And they figured, gosh, it's going to cost us less money because those guys use up a tremendous amount of resources falling over in the street. They're hospitalized. They found in the first 6 months they cut public expenses in dealing with them by half per alcoholic. But then they found out something remarkable. They were still alcoholics, they weren't social drinkers, but they cut their drinking by a third too. Because if you put a guy in a comfortable, warm place and you say, if you want to drink, you can drink, as a rule, they cut back their drinking. They didn't need to drink as much, they didn't feel impelled to drink as much, they didn't have the motivation to drink as much. As I said, they weren't wine drinkers, they only knew one way to drink, but they actually cut back their drinking as well. So what's that say? Give people a warm place to live where they're homeless, and odds are that in and of itself will reduce their likelihood of addiction and increase their likelihood of remission.
For me, the Lower East Side needle exchange program back in the early 90s was one of my first points of contact with harm reduction. I may have been reading about it, I've seen some of it in action in Europe, but I was teaching at Princeton late 80s and early 90s, and I needed to show my students. So one time we went down to Philadelphia, and what was his name, Jean-Paul Hammond, who's no longer around, was doing that, and that was a real eye-opener for my students, and even to some extent for me, just seeing people lining up there. But I remember taking my students once or twice down to the Lower East Side Needle Exchange in the early 90s, when it was on, I think, Avenue C maybe. And just once again, it was a spectacular opportunity, especially for some of my white middle-class students, but even some of the African-American students, to, you know, to see an injecting drug user not as this other figure and as this junkie or demon, and then seeing, you know, people from all walks of life, people, you know, dressed like I am, or people really, you know, messed up or whatever, people with kids, and to see people, and actually some of them would volunteer to actually, you know, hand out the syringes and the kits and all this stuff, and it was a very kind of personal, transformative thing. So I've always felt this kind of you know, connection with that program.
My vision for the future of LES is that we can in fact remain in the forefront as a pioneer. Because if you look back to the beginning of LES, we were a pioneer in identifying a need and responding to it. But it's not as if the needs have stopped. The needs have changed. New needs have emerged. And it is incumbent upon those of us who have the strength and the moxie to get out there and say, here are the needs, and we're not afraid to buck the mainstream. We're not afraid to be on the margin. But we know that the strategies that we've engaged in and that we're proposing are effective. Effective public health strategies, effective strategies for engaging people and demonstrating that there are other ways of engaging their behaviors, modifying their behaviors. And so that's where I see us going. We live in a building on the Lower East Side which is extraordinarily cramped for us. And so one of the main things that we're looking at now is finding a new home, finding a home that will have enough space for programming now and as we grow in the future, a space that can in fact be made amenable and welcoming for all our participants, and that really will provide the array of services and actual space that we need to address our participants. So that's the vision.